In movies and television shows, vampires are typically portrayed as having to abide by certain rules, such as needing to be invited into a person's home. Many think there's only one set of rules for vampires, whereas others think that rules vary depending on the movie or story. This video introduces you to an important rule about the ways vampires and humans enter each other's homes in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula by going through the 6 steps of CRIT. CRIT stands for Close Reading Interpretative Tool. This process helps readers to provide a close reading of a passage and to understand a certain passage better. The 6 steps of CRIT consist of paraphrase, observe, contextualize, analyze, argue, and reflect.
Students often think about text in terms of broad generalizations, like, what is this book about? What are this text's universal themes? And how is it relevant to my personal life?
Step 1. Paraphrase. Let's start off by reading the passage. In the welcoming scene in Chapter 2, Dracula is speaking to Jonathan Harker. Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will. He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. Again he said, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." The strength of the handshake was so much akin to that which I had noticed in the driver, whose face I had not seen, that for a moment I doubted if it were not the same person to whom I was speaking. So to make sure, I said interrogatively, "Count Dracula?" He bowed in a courtly way as he replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome. Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in, the night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." As he was speaking, he put the lamp on a bracket on the wall, and stepping out, took my luggage. He had carried it in before I could forestall him. Paraphrasing consists of summarizing the main parts of the passage in order to understand what is happening, who is talking, and what is being said. For example, we know the speaker, Jonathan Harker, the main character of the story, A. describes meeting Dracula for the first time and how it makes him feel uneasy, B. notices Dracula's handshake is inhuman, and C. experiences Dracula's excessive welcoming as he enters Castle Dracula for the first time.
Step 2. Observe. Observing the passage is really looking at the text, rather than what it is saying. Doing this step requires us to look at the different elements of the text, such as imagery, word choice, sounds, word repetition, and changes in vocabulary or tone. This is when you want to start marking up the passage with any observations you may have. First, we can see that the entire passage revolves around welcoming, which is repeated 4 times throughout the passage, highlighted in blue. This repetition shows Dracula's over-welcoming nature. Secondly, we can see that Jonathan notices Dracula's handshake is abnormal, in the sense that it is very strong and it is as cold as ice. This description, marked in purple, acknowledges Dracula's paranormal figure early on. Next, we can observe how the aggressive word choice of the passage, marked in red, sets a very ominous tone, putting Jonathan on edge and making the whole exchange uncomfortable for both the reader and Jonathan. Along with the abnormal tone set by Dracula's handshake, Jonathan also notes in his journal that his hand felt more like the hand of a dead than a living man. This statement, highlighted in green, foreshadows the true nature of Dracula. Finally, we can also observe that the first 2 paragraphs begin with Dracula saying, "Welcome to my house," in bold font. This can be interpreted as Dracula hurrying Jonathan into his house.
Now that we have a good understanding of the passage, let's take a step back for a moment and look at the historical and biographical features of the book as a whole. This step is known as Step 3, Contextualize. Let's start by discussing some historical facts that might be significant to the passage, such as Victorian laws about breaking and entering, or traditional vampire rules. Old Victorian laws on breaking and entering are as follows. A landlord or agent may enter a rental property, but it is offensive for them to enter unless they have a reasonable excuse. Also, if a landlord or agent wants to enter the house, they must give at least 24 hours notice and provide a written notice stating the reason for entry. A person entering the property in accordance to the Act must do so in a reasonable manner, unless they have the tenant's consent, and may not stay longer than necessary. Victorian-era laws play a crucial part in this passage for several reasons. The first reason being that Dracula takes place during the Victorian period. Vampire rules also relate to the law of breaking and entering because, traditionally, they are not allowed into homes unless welcomed by the owner. Now let's look at the author, Bram Stoker. Something about him that is significant to this passage is that his mother read him ghost stories as a child. This fact is crucial because it could have influenced how he wrote his book, Dracula, and opened his mind to traditional vampire rules.
Step 4. Analyze. This step requires us to review the context and features we looked at in steps 2 and 3 as being possibly significant, and then to explain how each is in fact significant. Here we'll ask questions like, which of these features and contexts seem somehow connected? In what way? Once we've chosen around 4 textual elements and/or contextual frames, we'll make analytical claims about their importance. For instance, we could claim that the repetition of the word welcome conveys the passage's main focus on Jonathan's first meeting of Dracula. We could also claim that Dracula's abnormal handshake with Jonathan, described as cold as ice, helps to explain the uncomfortable nature of their future interactions. Additionally, we might claim that words such as interrogatively, grasped, impulsively, and instant convey the stern and controlled feelings given by Dracula throughout the passage. Finally, we might claim, starting with very similar phrases in the first 2 paragraphs, illustrates a major shift when the 3rd paragraph starts with a question.
Step 5. Argue. Having made all of these analytical claims, now we can offer an interpretation of the passage as a whole. In Step 5, Argue, we're asked to write 1 paragraph that builds upon our responses to the Step 4 prompt, and all of our work in the previous steps. Bram Stoker's 2nd chapter of Dracula describes an odd encounter. These 2 equally sized paragraphs convey Stoker's ideas about the restrictive rules of vampires entering homes and the fair Victorian laws of breaking and entering. This argument relates back to Dracula continuously welcoming Jonathan into his home.
The last step of CRIT consists of reflecting the interpretations that we've previously reviewed. Here we ask, what aspects of the passage remain confusing? What elements does our interpretation neglect or set aside? What parts of our argument appear debatable or dubious? And what objections could a reasonable person raise about our interpretation? A. Why is it important that Jonathan describes Dracula's stillness twice throughout the passage? B. Our group neglected to address the similarities between the coach driver and Dracula. C. One could argue that vampire rules were not influenced by Victorian-era laws. D. One could say that Dracula was only being hospitable.
If you would like to learn more about the CRIT process, visit the CRIT homepage at the University of Texas at Austin.